He abandoned the woman who took care of his family until the past forced him to face the truth. João Batista was sitting in his spacious living room, the large windows allowing the sunlight to flood the space, illuminating the dark wooden furniture and the old paintings on the walls. For many, this scene would be a reflection of a successful life. At 70 years old, he had achieved everything he set out to do. The real estate empire he built was his greatest accomplishment, the result of decades of hard work and ruthless decisions. The proud smile as he recalled his victories, however, was hollow. To others, João had always been a man admired for his success, but feared for his coldness. He rarely showed empathy, and those around him knew that his business always came first. His office, next to the living room, was where he spent most of his time. Behind the mahogany desk, he made calls and reviewed reports with the same seriousness as decades before. Across the hall, Marcelo, his only son, was buried in a pile of papers. Since he started helping manage the family business, he felt a silent but constant pressure. Unlike his father, Marcelo was never comfortable with tough decisions. While reviewing a list of upcoming evictions, he hesitated when he saw the name of a tenant, Dona Isabel. He read the name several times, feeling a sense of unease, as if something was out of place. Isabel, he murmured to himself, trying to force his memory to make a connection, but nothing came immediately. He knew she was one of the many tenants behind on rent, which, to João, was more than enough reason for eviction. That night, during dinner, Marcelo tried to bring up the subject with his father. "Dad, about this list of evictions," he began, choosing his words carefully. João, always pragmatic, looked up from his plate. "There's nothing to discuss, Marcelo. If they don't pay, they have to go. We can't carry dead weight." Marcelo frowned. "Dona Isabel, her name sounds familiar. Doesn't it remind you of anyone?" João Batista took a sip of wine, showing no emotion. "Familiar? She's just another delinquent tenant. It doesn't matter." João's dry response didn't surprise Marcelo, but the lack of any reaction to the name left him more intrigued. He knew there was more to it, something his father was not acknowledging. Marcelo let the matter drop for that night, but his mind kept racing. He needed to find out who this woman was and why her name caused him such deep discomfort. The next day, Marcelo returned to the office. With the documents in front of him, he began searching for more information about Dona Isabel. As he pulled up old records, he realized that she had lived in that apartment for over 3 decades, long before he took any role in the family business. Marcelo wondered how a woman with so much time in residence could have fallen into such a difficult situation. He decided to dig deeper. After a few phone calls, he uncovered something that shocked him. Dona Isabel was not just any tenant. She had been, many years ago, the caregiver who had stood by his mother, Teresa, in her final years. The woman who was now on the brink of eviction had cared for his family during one of the most difficult times. The memories came back slowly, like a fog starting to lift. He remembered how Isabel would calm him when his mother was ill, how she held him when he was scared. After Teresa's death, Isabel had disappeared from his life without explanation. Marcelo had never known why. With these memories flooding his thoughts, Marcelo felt a weight in his chest. His father, João Batista, had probably erased this part of his history because of the pain of grief, but now Marcelo felt compelled to confront it. João's indifference toward Isabel was disturbing. It was as if all that past, all those memories, meant nothing to him. Without telling his father, Marcelo made a decision. He would visit Dona Isabel. Marcelo drove through the city streets with restless thoughts. At every stoplight, at every turn, more images from the past surfaced in his mind. Small flashes of Dona Isabel appeared, the smell of freshly brewed coffee in the morning, her soft voice consoling him when he woke up from nightmares, the moments when his mother, Teresa, was too ill to give him attention. Isabel had been a constant presence, an almost motherly figure. But then, out of nowhere, she had vanished from his life. And now, after so many years, he was on his way to see her. When he finally arrived at Isabel's building, Marcelo was surprised by its condition. The building was old, with worn facades and peeling paint, very different from the luxury properties he and his father managed. The contrast left him uncomfortable. Why had no one done anything for her before? Climbing the narrow, dimly lit stairs, each step seemed to add to the weight on his shoulders. He stopped in front of the door marked with the number 12 and took a deep breath before knocking. The door opened slowly, and there she was, Donna Isabel, now 80 years old. Time had left its marks. Her hair completely grey, her hands twisted with arthritis, and her posture hunched. However, her eyes, though tired, still shone with the same kindness as before. "Marcelo?" she asked, with a mix of surprise and disbelief. "Yes, it's me, Donna Isabel. It's been a long time." He smiled, trying to hide his discomfort. She invited him in with a gentle gesture. The apartment was small and modest, with few pieces of furniture and simple decorations. The poverty of the place hit him hard. He knew Isabel's situation was difficult, but he hadn't imagined it was so severe. The shame of having allowed her to reach this condition grew inside him. Sitting in the living room, Isabel began to recount how her life had continued after Teresa's death. She showed no resentment, nor did she speak of her struggles with bitterness. On the contrary, there was a serenity in her words. She recalled the time she cared for Marcelo, how his mother always worried about him, even on the days when the illness consumed her. Isabel had become a sort of substitute mother for him, and Marcelo began to realize how important she had been in his childhood. "I always thought of you, Marcelo," said Isabel, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm glad to see that you've grown up well." The simplicity and dignity with which she spoke touched Marcelo deeply. She, who had given so much to his family, now sat there alone in a small apartment, facing financial and health problems. He couldn't believe that Juan Batista, his father, had completely ignored this part of their past. "Why did you leave?" Marcelo finally asked, unable to contain his curiosity. Isabel looked at him, her eyes filling with sadness. "After your mother passed away, your father thought it would be better to sever ties with the past. He was too hurt. He simply let me go, without saying much." Marcelo shook his head, partly understanding, but also revolting against Juan Batista's coldness. Now, more than ever, he knew he had to help Donna Isabel. She had been part of his story, of his childhood, and in some way, he felt indebted to her. As he left the apartment, Marcelo was shaken. The visit had left him with a whirlwind of emotions, nostalgia, guilt, and above all, the feeling that something had to be done. He couldn't allow her to be evicted. He couldn't ignore what he had discovered. And certainly, he couldn't continue to accept his father's indifference. Back at the office the next day, Marcelo sat down with Juan Batista and once again tried to reason with him. "Dad, I found out who Donna Isabel is. She took care of me and Mom when I was a child. She was by our side during the hardest times." Juan Batista looked up from his desk, visibly uncomfortable, but his expression remained hard. "That was a long time ago, Marcelo. She's just another tenant now." "But she's not just another tenant to me. She was part of our family." Juan remained silent for a few seconds before finally responding coldly. "Family doesn't pay the bills." Those words cut Marcelo. He felt frustration rise within him, but he decided not to argue further at that moment. Instead, he made a firm decision. He would help Donna Isabel, with or without his father's support. The soft sound of Marcelo's footsteps echoed in the narrow hallway of Isabel's building. As he climbed the stairs, the weight of his decision grew heavier. He knew he was about to revisit a forgotten part of his childhood, one that now returned with force. He hadn't mentioned anything to his father. João Batista had been clear. To him, Isabel was just another tenant, but Marcelo knew that was far from the truth. She had been more than a caregiver. She had been an almost maternal figure in one of the most difficult times of his life. When he reached the door, he hesitated. He raised his hand to knock, but did so cautiously. He felt nervous, almost like a stranger intruding on the privacy of someone who had once been so close. Isabel opened the door slowly, and her face showed surprise when she recognized him. Marcelo. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. He smiled shyly. "Hi, Donna Isabel. Sorry for showing up unannounced, but I needed to see you." She stepped back, opening the door wider and gesturing for him to come in. "Come in, please." The apartment was small, much more modest than he had imagined. The environment had a disarming simplicity. There was no luxury, just the essentials for a quiet and dignified life, but everything carried an air of wear. The atmosphere, however, was light, perfumed with a subtle aroma of tea and old memories. Donna Isabel, visibly weakened by age, moved with difficulty. Arthritis affected her movements, but she insisted on taking care of her own home. Marcelo watched as she approached a small chair and slowly sat down. "It's so good to see you after all these years," she said with a warm smile. "You've grown up, Marcelo. You've become a man." Marcelo sat across from her, feeling a wave of emotions. I didn't know you still lived here. When I saw your name, I remembered everything. I couldn't believe it." Isabel nodded slowly, her gaze serene but full of stories yet untold. "Yes, I stayed. This apartment has been my home for so long. It hasn't been easy, but I was always grateful for the time I spent with your mother and with you." Marcelo swallowed hard when he heard that. Childhood memories began to flow. He remembered the days when Isabel would take him to the park, the afternoons when she read stories to him when Teresa was too sick to get out of bed. There had been a genuine kindness in everything Isabel did. It was a kindness he hadn't noticed at the time, but now seemed so clear. "I had no idea things were so difficult for you," Marcelo said, trying to hide his discomfort. "Are you alone here, Donna Isabel?" She gave a sad but resigned smile. "Oh, I have some good neighbors. Claudio, for example. He's lived here for years and always helps me with little things. He carries my groceries when I need them and sometimes accompanies me to doctor appointments. He's a good friend." Marcelo felt a pang of guilt. Donna Isabel, who had cared for him with so much affection, now depended on the goodwill of neighbors. His father had allowed her to be forgotten, and he himself, unknowingly, had done the same. They talked for a long time. Isabel told stories of his childhood, stories about his mother Teresa, and each word brought a new dimension to Marcelo's memories. It was strange how he had forgotten so many details, but at the same time he felt grateful to rediscover everything now. When he finally got up to leave, Marcelo couldn't hide his emotion. He knew he had to do something. She couldn't continue living in that state of uncertainty, at the mercy of an imminent eviction. "I promise, Donna Isabel," he said, with firmness in his voice. "I will take care of this. You don't need to worry." She smiled, grateful but not expecting much. "You were always a good boy, Marcelo. I trust you." As he left, Marcelo felt different. It was as if, by revisiting that part of his past, he had rediscovered something essential about himself, but he also knew that the road ahead would be difficult. João Batista was not an easy man to convince, and Marcelo would need much more than memories of the past to change his father's stance. When he returned home, Marcelo was determined. Help for Isabel would not just come in kind words. He knew that somehow he needed to find a solution, and if Juan Bautista refused to help, then he would do whatever was necessary on his own. The next morning, Marcelo entered his father's office, determined to confront him once more. Juan Bautista was focused on a report, as usual. The spreadsheets of profits and expenses were his only companions, and the unshakable focus he showed in business had always impressed Marcelo, though it also made him uncomfortable. But today, there was something more urgent to discuss. "Dad, we need to talk about Donna Isabel," Marcelo began, his voice firm but still restrained. Juan Bautista barely glanced up from the papers in front of him. "We've already talked about this. She's just another delinquent tenant. We can't do favors, Marcelo." Marcelo sighed, controlling his frustration. He knew that confronting his father head-on never worked, but Isabel's situation couldn't wait any longer. He needed to try a different approach, something that could touch his father in some way. "She's not just another tenant. She took care of me, of us, when Mom was sick. Do you remember that?" Juan Bautista, still reluctant, looked up for a brief moment, but his face remained impassive. "Yes, I remember. And that was decades ago. I don't see how that changes the current situation." "Dad, she's living in difficult conditions. If you saw how she's living, you would understand. Isabel took care of us in one of the hardest times of our lives, and now she's about to be evicted. We can't ignore this." There was a moment of silence. Juan Bautista seemed to be thinking, but soon returned to his usual posture. "You're being too emotional, Marcelo. I understand that you have good intentions, but business is business. I built this company on rational decisions, and that's how we will continue." The coldness in Juan Bautista's words left Marcelo even more irritated. How could his father be so insensitive? This wasn't a matter of business. It was a matter of humanity. He knew that for Juan, memories of his wife Teresa were too painful to revisit, but Marcelo couldn't understand why he kept this barrier so high. And if it were Mum? What would you do if it were her living in that situation? That question seemed to hit Juan Bautista in an unexpected way. For the first time in that conversation, a shadow of emotion crossed his face, even if for just a moment. He lowered his eyes to the desk, the pen he was holding suspended in mid-air. However, the emotional barrier he had built over the years soon returned. Teresa has been gone for a long time. That doesn't change what needs to be done now. Marcelo felt the knot in his throat tighten. It was like talking to a wall. Juan Bautista had completely shut down, unable to see what was truly at stake. With no other choice, Marcelo stood up from his chair and looked directly at his father. "I'm going to help Donna Isabel, with or without your support. I can't stand by while someone who was so important to our family suffers like this." Juan Bautista remained silent. His eyes were fixed on the papers in front of him, but there was something different in his posture. Marcelo didn't wait for a response. He left the office with firm steps, but his heart felt heavy. He knew that defying his father like this would have consequences, but he couldn't ignore what needed to be done any longer. Later that day, as Marcelo walked through Donna Isabel's neighborhood, he came across an elderly man carrying grocery bags toward Isabel's building. The man was thin, with short white hair and dressed in simple clothes, but his expression was calm, almost serene. "You must be Marcelo," the man said, smiling as he recognized him. "I'm Claudio, Isabel's neighbor. She told me you visited yesterday." Marcelo smiled back, surprised to be recognized so quickly. "Yes, I was there. She spoke very highly of you." Claudio nodded, setting the bags down for a moment. "Isabel is a strong woman. Even after everything she's been through, she's never lost her dignity. I help her with what I can, but she rarely asks for anything. Very proud, you know." Marcelo felt a wave of gratitude for that man. Knowing that Isabel had someone like Claudio nearby brought some relief, but it also reinforced the idea that she needed more support. "I'm trying to help the best I can," Marcelo said, "but it's been difficult convincing my father to do the same." Claudio looked at him with understanding. "Sometimes people close themselves off to pain in ways they don't even realize. Your father might need more time, or something to remind him of who he was before the loss." Claudio's words sounded wise, carrying the weight of a life experience that Marcelo had yet to grasp. There was something about that man that exuded calm, as if he had learned from life that time can be both a blessing and a curse. Marcelo thanked Claudio and went on his way, now with a new perspective. Perhaps it wasn't just about convincing his father to help Donna Isabel. Maybe, for Juan Bautista, it was a matter of confronting his own losses, his own failures. Marcelo realized that to save Isabel, he might also need to save his father. The afternoon slowly waned as Juan Bautista arrived home, exhausted after another day of work. His body was beginning to feel the weight of the years, although he would never admit it out loud. His house, large and silent, seemed to weigh on him as much as the business. It was the reflection of a life dedicated to success, but one that had left behind bonds and affection. He walked to the living room as he did every day, and as he tried to sit on the sofa, he felt a sharp pain in his back. João tried to ignore the pain, but it intensified with each passing second, climbing up his spine like an electric current. He groaned softly, trying to adjust, but with a sudden movement, the pain exploded with such force that it made him lose his balance and fall to the floor. The impact was hard, and for a moment he lay still, dazed, his body unable to respond to his command. He tried to get up, but the pain was unbearable, radiating throughout his spine. He felt panic rising as he realized he was alone, unable to move. Marcelo was in the office when he received the call. The voice of the housekeeper, distressed, informed him that his father had fallen and was being taken to the hospital. He dropped everything he was doing and went straight there, his heart racing with worry and a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts swirling in his mind. Despite all the tension between them, Juan Bautista was still his father. When he arrived at the hospital, he saw João in a bed, surrounded by doctors. He was pale, with an expression of pain Marcelo had never seen before. His father had always been a strong man, but now he looked more vulnerable than Marcelo could ever have imagined. "His condition is stable," said the doctor. "It was a hard fall and he hurt his spine. He'll need complete rest and assistance for daily activities for quite some time." Daily assistance. Those words echoed in Marcelo's mind. He knew João Bautista would hate the idea of depending on someone. He had always been self-sufficient, imposing, never needing help for anything. Marcelo thanked the doctor and sat by his father's bed, who kept his eyes closed, breathing with difficulty. Hours passed and João woke up. He looked at his son, still without speaking, but his eyes revealed a mix of physical pain and something else, a silent admission of his fragility. Marcelo realized this was a rare moment. His father, for years unreachable in his armor of coldness and self-sufficiency, was now unprotected. This vulnerability was, in a way, what he needed to confront his own emotions. "You need help, Dad," Marcelo said, breaking the silence, "and I have an idea." João turned his face slowly, but he said nothing. He just waited. "Donna Isabel," Marcelo continued. "She took care of me when I was little. She took care of Mom when we needed her most. Now she's struggling, but she has experience with caregiving. Why not hire her to help you? It would be a way for you to receive care from someone you trust, and it would give her a job that could save her situation." For a moment, João remained silent, absorbing his son's words. Marcelo's suggestion seemed absurd at first glance, bringing back someone he had deliberately left in the past. And more than that, having to depend on someone, being cared for. It was the opposite of everything he had always believed in. At first, I didn't think of it as an option. But now, it seems to make sense. Marcelo continued, trying to ease the idea. I know it's hard to admit that we need help, Dad, but Isabel is here, and it would be an opportunity to help both of you. Juan Bautista closed his eyes, exhausted. The pain in his body and the weight of the situation made him feel even more powerless. He didn't respond immediately, but Marcelo noticed a subtle change in his expression. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. João's pride was still there, strong, but the harsh reality of his condition was beginning to force cracks in that barrier. In the following days, while João Bautista recovered in the hospital, Marcelo continued to push the idea. He knew he couldn't force his father to accept, but he also knew that this was the only way to help both Isabel and João. When the doctor finally approved João's return home, it became clear that he couldn't be left alone. The moment of decision had arrived. A week later, back at the family home, João Bautista, still with his face marked by pain and reluctance, looked at Marcelo and finally said, "Bring Isabel." For Marcelo, that was a small triumph. His father wasn't just accepting help, he was accepting Isabel back into their lives. It was a step, small but important, towards something bigger. Marcelo picked up the phone and called Isabel. On the other end of the line, her tired voice responded with surprise and emotion. She had never expected to receive that call, much less from João Bautista. Isabel would once again be part of that family, and fate was beginning to weave a new thread in their shared stories. The following days were a mix of anxiety and contained expectations for Marcelo. He had spoken with Isabel, and she, though surprised and somewhat reluctant, accepted the job. What else could she do? Her life circumstances didn't allow her to refuse such an opportunity. However, returning to João Bautista's house after so much time carried an emotional weight. The day of Isabel's arrival was quiet. João Bautista was at home, sitting in his usual chair, still with a rigid posture, despite the constant pain he felt in his back. He didn't want to show weakness. Even now, dependent on care, his pride kept him distant. When the doorbell rang, Marcelo was the one who opened the door. Isabel was there, her posture slightly bent by age, but her eyes firm and her expression determined. She entered the house with a mix of nostalgia and nervousness. The last time she had been there, Teresa was still alive. Now, the air in the house felt different, heavy, almost stagnant with the time and memories João refused to revisit. "Thank you for having me, Marcelo," Isabel said, her voice as gentle as ever. "I'll do my best to help your father." Marcelo smiled, though he knew that this would be a difficult journey for both of them. "I know you will, Isabel. I know he's not easy, but we need you now, maybe more than ever." Isabel nodded kindly, and with a heavy heart, entered the room where João was. He didn't rise when he saw her, only tilted his head slightly in acknowledgement. The two remained silent for a few moments, the weight of the past separating them like an invisible barrier. "João," Isabel said, breaking the silence softly, "I'm here to help." He averted his gaze, still with the same resistance, but responded in a restrained manner. "Thank you for accepting." Those words, though brief, were a sign to Marcelo that something was changing. João Bautista had never been a man of kind words, and the fact that he even acknowledged Isabel's presence was progress. Now she would be there, daily, helping him with his most basic needs, something João had never imagined allowing. The first days were complicated. João Bautista, even physically weakened, did everything he could to maintain an emotional distance from Isabel. He followed his treatments with reluctance and impatience, but Isabel remained calm, patient. She knew she couldn't rush things. Time would be the only thing capable of smoothing the edges of that man hardened by life and pain. As the days passed, however, small changes began to occur. João began to allow Isabel to help him with simple tasks like getting dressed or organizing the house. It wasn't easy for him to admit that he needed her, but something in his gaze had changed. It was as if the memories of Teresa were beginning to resonate differently in his mind, provoked by Isabel's constant presence. One day, as she helped João walk around the room, he observed her more closely. The care with which Isabel treated him, even after everything that had happened, was something he hadn't expected. João found himself at times thinking about how his wife Teresa had trusted Isabel so much, and that made him realize how much he had erased from his own memory just to avoid dealing with the pain. "You took care of her in her last days, didn't you?" João asked, his voice rough, while Isabel helped him sit down. Isabel, without hesitation, responded with the same tranquility that always characterized her. "Yes, João, I was with Teresa until the end. It was an honor to care for her, and for you all." João remained silent, and that moment resonated with an intensity that neither of them could express in words. He knew deep down that Isabel had always been loyal to the family, even when he, consumed by grief, had pushed her away without explanation. Marcelo observed this coexistence from a distance. He saw with some hope that Isabel's presence was beginning to provoke subtle changes in his father's behavior. João was no longer the indestructible man Marcelo knew. Now, in vulnerability, something was being rebuilt. A new connection, slow and painful, but undeniably real, was emerging. Moreover, Marcelo's relationship with Isabel was strengthening. They spent more time together, talking about Teresa, about the past, and also about Isabel's situation. Marcelo didn't want her to live forever as a caregiver, but he knew that this temporary job was giving her the support she needed. One day, while João was sleeping, Marcelo and Isabel sat on the porch to talk. The sun was setting, painting the sky with orange hues, and the afternoon's silence seemed to fill the air with a certain peace. "Do you think he'll change, Isabel?" Marcelo asked, looking at the horizon. Isabel smiled with her serene wisdom. "Everyone changes, Marcelo. Some take longer, others resist. But I believe that deep down, your father is beginning to see things differently. Sometimes pain opens paths we never imagined." Marcelo nodded, thinking about her words. He knew the road was still long, but that coexistence was, little by little, revealing a João Batista he had never known, and perhaps it was just the beginning of a great transformation. Marcelo made his way to his father's house as he did every day since Isabel started working for the family again. The routine was settling in, but there was still tension in the air, as if something was about to happen. João Batista accepted Isabel's care, but he remained distant, emotionally locked in his own defenses. Even with small changes, the ice around his heart was still thick. When he arrived at João's building, Marcelo saw Claudio sitting on a bench in the small garden at the entrance, watching the street's movement. Claudio was the kind of person who, even in his simplicity, exuded a quiet wisdom. Marcelo couldn't help but approach him. "Good morning, Claudio," Marcelo greeted with a smile, sitting next to the neighbor. Claudio returned the nod, without taking his eyes off the street. "Good morning, Marcelo. How are things with your father?" the neighbor asked, his voice full of genuine curiosity. Marcelo sighed, crossing his arms. "Difficult, as always. He's so stubborn, Claudio. Even though he accepts Isabel's help, it's like he refuses to truly open up." Claudio chuckled softly, his serene gaze fixed on something distant, perhaps an old memory. Stubbornness. Well, that's something time can soften, but not always easily. Marcelo remained silent, absorbing the words. There was something about Claudio that made him want to listen more. It was as if the man had found a way to deal with life's adversities that Marcelo was still far from understanding. "I lost my wife early," Claudio said suddenly, his voice calm, as if he were just recalling something ordinary. "She was my world. When she was gone, I thought I'd never move on." Marcelo looked at him in surprise. Claudio had never spoken about his wife before. He waited for the neighbor to continue, not wanting to interrupt. "For a while I shut myself off, just like your father. I didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want to accept help. I was stuck in my own grief, but eventually I realized that the more I closed myself off, the lonelier I became. And loneliness, my friend, can be a silent enemy." Marcelo nodded, feeling Claudio's words resonate with his own experience with João. "And what changed? How did you manage to move forward?" Claudio gave a slight smile. "I found that helping others helped me deal with my own pain. I started doing little things for the neighbors, simple things, like carrying groceries or helping someone up after a fall. And over time, I realized that I had found peace. Not by forgetting my wife, but by honoring her memory the best way I could." The simplicity of that statement hit Marcelo like a revelation. He had always been so focused on trying to change his father, on breaking down the wall João Batista had built around himself, that he hadn't realized the power empathy and care could have. Claudio hadn't forced anything in his life. He had simply chosen to open up to others, and that's how he found peace. "Do you think my father can still change?" Marcelo asked, more to himself than to Claudio. Claudio looked at him, his eyes full of understanding. "Everyone can change, Marcelo. But change doesn't come from imposition. It comes from the willingness to see what really matters. Sometimes all your father needs is a mirror to see what he's missing." Those words stayed with Marcelo as he got up to head to his father's house. He said goodbye to Claudio with a wave, feeling lighter but also more determined. His father had spent years hiding behind his rigidity, but maybe, with Isabel's help and time, he could finally see what he had been missing. The value of human connections, the affection that had always been there, but that he insisted on ignoring. Inside the house, João was sitting in his armchair, with Isabel a few feet away, organizing some medications on the table. The scene seemed like an already established routine, but there was something subtle in the air. João was looking at Isabel in a different way, more attentively, as if he was starting to notice something that had previously gone unnoticed. Marcelo approached and sat next to his father, who glanced at him without saying anything. The silence between them was common, but this time it felt less oppressive, more natural. "I was talking to Claudio outside," Marcelo said, trying to start a conversation that might reach his father in some way. "He has an interesting outlook on life. He lost his wife many years ago, but he found a way to deal with it by helping others." João didn't respond immediately, but Marcelo noticed that his father was listening. It was a small step, but a sign that João might be starting to consider the words Marcelo had been insisting on saying. "I think that sometimes we have to learn to accept help, Dad. It's not weakness. In fact, it can be a sign of strength. Claudio found a way to deal with loss, and maybe we can learn something from him." João Batista remained silent, but something in his posture seemed less rigid. He still wasn't ready to talk about his own emotions, but maybe, just maybe, he was starting to think about them. Marcelo hoped that with time, his father could finally see what was in front of him, Isabel himself, and the chance to start again in a different way. The days passed slowly, and the routine at João Batista's house began to stabilize. Isabel, with her patience and care, gradually gained more space in João's life. She helped him with daily tasks, but she also took care of the little details he could no longer manage on his own. The forced coexistence began to transform into something different, even though João resisted admitting it. Marcelo visited his father regularly, and Claudio's presence in the family's life had also become constant. More and more, Claudio shared his life experiences, and Marcelo absorbed those lessons with gratitude. João, however, remained distant from these conversations, as if any mention of emotions or past memories was something he wasn't ready to face. That afternoon, while Isabel was organizing João's medications in silence, he watched her. Something about Isabel, in the way she treated him with care and patience, was beginning to awaken memories he had worked so hard to bury. "You've always been like this, haven't you?" João said, his rough voice breaking the silence in the room. Isabel, surprised, looked at him. "Like what?" "So patient. You never complained. You were always there, even on the worst days." Isabel smiled softly. "I just did what was necessary, João. Your family meant a lot to me." João shifted in his chair, visibly uncomfortable, as if he were about to say something he had been holding on to for a long time. "I fired you, right after Teresa died. No explanations. No goodbye." Isabel watched him calmly, her eyes showing a silent understanding, as if she had been expecting this conversation for many years. "I understood at the time. You were grieving, João. We all were." João shook his head, as if even mentioning the pain was something he tried to avoid at all costs. "You didn't understand. I didn't know how to handle any of it. When Teresa died, something inside me died with her. And the only way I found to keep going was to push away everything that reminded me of her. You were part of that." Isabel listened carefully, not interrupting him. She knew that this moment was rare, and that João Batista was finally opening a small door in his heart, a door he had kept shut for decades. I should have thanked you," João continued, struggling. "You did more for my family than I ever admitted, and instead of valuing you, I pushed you away. I couldn't even look at you because you reminded me of Teresa, and I didn't know how to deal with that." Isabel nodded slowly, understanding and forgiveness reflected in her eyes. "João, there's nothing to forgive. Everyone deals with loss in different ways. I never held any resentment toward you." Those words, so simple yet so powerful, hit João Batista like a blow. For all those years, he had kept himself a prisoner of his own guilt and grief, believing that his actions had isolated him from any possibility of reconciliation with the past. But there, in that moment, Isabel was offering him something he had never expected: forgiveness. "I failed," João said, his voice lower, almost a whisper. "I failed you. I failed Marcelo, and most of all, I failed Teresa." Isabel moved closer and placed her hand on his in a gesture of compassion. "You did what you could, João. We all make mistakes, but there's always time to make peace with the past." João closed his eyes, absorbing those words. For the first time in a long time, he felt that he was, in some way, allowing the barriers in his soul to begin to give way. The memories of Teresa, once too painful to revisit, now seemed less intense, as if Isabel was softening the pain by reminding him of a fundamental truth. Life goes on, and with it, the chance for redemption. In that moment, João Batista realized that he had wasted years running from his feelings, from his family, and most of all from himself. But there, in Isabel's presence, he finally admitted to himself and to her that he was ready to start changing. It wouldn't be easy, he knew, but the first step had already been taken. Later, Marcelo entered the room, unaware of the conversation that had taken place between João and Isabel. He noticed something different in his father's eyes, a lightness he hadn't seen in years. João looked at his son with a softer gaze and, without words, gave a slight nod, as if acknowledging that something inside him had changed. Marcelo smiled back, sensing that in some way Isabel's presence was beginning to make a real difference. He didn't know what his father had said, but he could see that something had broken inside the man who had been so rigid and closed off. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Marcelo felt that there was hope, and as he looked at Isabel, he knew that she had always been the key to opening the doors of João's heart. The days passed slowly, but there was something different in the air. Marcelo noticed that his father, although still a man of few words, was more present in some way. João Batista, the once impenetrable man, was beginning to show small, almost imperceptible changes in how he interacted. They weren't grand gestures, but for Marcelo, who knew his father so well, these signs were enough to show that the emotional healing process was underway. That afternoon, Marcelo decided it was the right time to take another step. He went to Isabel's house, as he had promised himself. When he arrived, he found her on the porch, watching the movement of the street with that serene look he so admired. The small apartment where she lived was well kept, but the place clearly didn't match the dignity and care Isabel deserved. "Marcelo," she said, with a warm smile when she saw him approaching. What a pleasant surprise. Marcelo sat next to her, taking a moment to breathe deeply before speaking. "Isabel, I've been thinking a lot about your situation. You've been so important to our family and to me, especially now. It doesn't make sense for you to continue living here, alone, facing so many difficulties." Isabel looked at him with tenderness, but also with slight resistance. "Marcelo, I have everything I need. This apartment may be simple, but it's been my home for many years." "I understand," he replied carefully, trying to find the right words. "But you've done so much for us, and I feel that now it's our turn to give back. I want you to live in a better place, closer to us, where you can have the comfort you deserve. We can take care of that." Isabel hesitated, her eyes softening as she processed the offer. There was a mix of emotion and surprise on her face. "You don't need to do this for me, Marcelo. I never expected anything in return." "I know you didn't expect it," Marcelo said firmly. "But this isn't about obligation. It's about wanting to do the right thing. You were like a mother to me in many moments of my life. I can't ignore that." There was a comfortable silence between them as the gentle breeze swayed the leaves of the trees around. Isabel finally nodded, accepting, though humbly, Marcelo's generosity. "All right," she said, her voice soft. "If it means that much to you, I accept." Marcelo smiled, feeling a wave of relief. He had taken this important step, and he knew that his father, despite his reluctance in many things, would also agree with the decision. Back at João's house, Marcelo decided to share the news. João was sitting in the living room, his posture still a bit stiff, but less defensive than usual. Marcelo sat next to him, without rushing, waiting for the right moment to speak. "Dad," he began, his voice calm, "I talked to Isabel. She accepted our offer to move to a house closer to us." João turned slowly to look at his son with an expression of curiosity. "You talked to her about that?" "Yes," Marcelo confirmed. "She was reluctant at first, as I expected, but she understood that this is important to us. I want her to be close. She deserves to live with dignity, and I think in some way this will also help us make amends for what happened in the past." João remained silent, absorbing Marcelo's words. He knew that Isabel deserved more than the life she was leading, but admitting that also meant accepting his own responsibility for what had happened years ago. However, there was something different in João at that moment. He didn't seem as resistant as before. After a long silence, João finally spoke. "I agree with you. She deserves it. And I want to help." The words came out restrained, but they were loaded with deep meaning. João Batista, the man who had always put business above everything, was now willing to extend a hand in a gesture of generosity. For Marcelo, it was more than he could have hoped for. "Thank you, Dad," Marcelo said sincerely. "That means a lot to me. And I believe it will mean a lot to Isabel, too." João nodded without saying anything more, but the gesture was enough. For the first time in a long time, they were in sync, united by a cause that transcended business, money, and even old pains. It was as if, finally, father and son were finding each other on new ground, a ground of empathy and compassion that both, in their own way, had ignored for so long. A few weeks later, Isabel moved into her new home. The place was small but cozy, with everything she needed to live comfortably. The house was just a few blocks away from Marcelo's family, which made visits easier and allowed her to feel safer. Claudio, the kind neighbor, continued to be a constant presence in Isabel's life. He helped her with the move, and from time to time he would stop by for coffee and a chat. The friendship between them was a source of comfort for Isabel, and Claudio, with his quiet wisdom, always seemed to know what to say to bring peace to those around him. Marcelo, for his part, felt that a new phase had begun. Isabel's move, his father's acceptance, all of it indicated that finally the wounds of the past were starting to heal. He knew there was still much to be done, but now, more than ever, he felt they were on the right path. And as Isabel settled into her new home, surrounded by the memories of a lifetime, she knew she was no longer alone. The family she had cared for in the past was now caring for her, and for her, that was the greatest gift of all. The day was sunny, and a light breeze rustled the trees in the backyard of Isabel's new house. The move had been completed weeks ago, and little by little, Isabel was adapting to the new routine. The house, though modest, was cozy and full of light, a reflection of the new chapter her life had taken. Marcelo visited frequently, bringing news of his father, and always left with a lighter heart. That evening, João Batista, after much insistence from Marcelo, decided it was time to visit Isabel in her new home. It was a difficult decision for him. It wasn't just a courtesy visit. It was, for João, a step toward what he had avoided for years, confronting the emotions and bonds he had allowed to crumble. Marcelo accompanied him to Isabel's door, both in silence. João, though physically more fragile, walked with a firm posture. When they arrived, it was Isabel who greeted them with a warm smile. Her gaze, as always, was full of serenity. "João," she said softly, opening the door and gesturing for him to come in. "It's so good to see you." João nodded, entering with slow but determined steps. He looked around, noticing how Isabel had transformed that small space into something that radiated peace. There were plants in the windows, a few books stacked on a table, and a sense of warmth in the air. João sat on the couch, while Isabel settled into a nearby chair. Marcelo stood by, watching his father with a mix of anxiety and hope. The tension in the air was palpable, but Isabel, with her gentle manner, began talking naturally about how the new house had been a blessing for her. For a while, the conversation flowed easily, but João Batista was visibly restless. Finally, he looked at Isabel with an expression Marcelo didn't recognize, a mix of regret and something that resembled vulnerability. "Isabel," João began, his voice firm but laden with emotion, "there's something I need to say." Isabel remained silent, attentive, while João searched for the words. "I failed you. For many years I let my pride and pain blind me. I made wrong choices, especially when it came to you and what happened after Teresa died." He paused, his eyes fixed on Isabel. "You were part of our family, and I treated you like a stranger. For that, I apologize." The words, though few, carried the weight of decades of silence and regret. Marcelo held his breath, knowing how difficult it had been for his father to say that. João Batista, always so rigid and impenetrable, was finally letting his guard down. Isabel smiled tenderly, her eyes shining with deep understanding. "João, there's no need to apologize. What happened, happened. We all suffered in different ways, and you suffered too. I never held a grudge against you." Those words, spoken with such sincerity, seemed to lift the burden João had been carrying. He took a deep breath, as if he could finally relax after so long. There was, in that moment, a sense of peace, something Marcelo had never witnessed between his father and Isabel. "Thank you," João replied, in a low but grateful voice. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that settles when the important things are said, when old wounds begin to heal. In the days that followed, João began visiting Isabel more often. What started as brief visits turned into moments of reflection, where they both shared memories of Teresa and the past, but in a lighter way. Isabel's serene presence seemed to have a calming effect on João, helping him deal with the pain and grief he had repressed for so long. Marcelo, watching from the sidelines, felt that his family was finally rebuilding itself, even if in a different way. He was closer to his father now, and together they were starting to forge a new path, where affection and understanding took the place that had once been filled only by business and ambitions. Claudio, Isabel's neighbor, also continued to be a constant presence. His friendship with Isabel flourished, and he offered Marcelo advice on the value of time and relationships, words that the young businessman took in with wisdom. Marcelo knew that, even with the passing of the years, the most important thing wasn't what he had built in business, but what he was beginning to build within his own home. One evening, while everyone was gathered at Isabel's house, Claudio said something that made everyone reflect. "Sometimes time takes many things from us, but it also gives us a second chance. We can't recover what was lost, but we can honor what we still have." Those words resonated deeply with João, who, sitting next to Isabel, felt that he finally understood what he had neglected for so long. It wasn't too late to rebuild the broken bridges, to reconnect with Marcelo, and to give the deserved value to those who had always stood by his side. Isabel, sitting close to João, smiled at him. That smile was more than a gesture of friendship. It was a sign that despite everything they had lived through, there was peace now. And in that moment, João, Marcelo, Isabel, and Claudio knew that despite everything, they had found something valuable, a new chance to live their lives with more lightness, gratitude, and above all, love. If you enjoyed this touching story about reconciliation and second chances, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Activate the bell so you won't miss the next stories full of twists and life lessons. Now we want to hear from you. What did you think of João Batista's transformation? Do you think he really managed to overcome his past and reconnect with his family? Or was there more left to be said? Leave your opinion in the comments. We want to know what you think. And of course, share this video with anyone you think will be moved by this journey of redemption and forgiveness. Your interaction is super important for us to continue bringing content like this. See you in the next video.